Every night at 11 o'clock, when the last musician packed up their instrument and the final audience member walked out the heavy brass doors, Thomas Rivera pushed his cleaning cart down the marble hallway of the Riverside Symphony Hall. The wheels squeaked softly, echoing through the empty building like a lonely song. Thomas had been doing this job for 15 years. 15 years of mopping the same floors, wiping down the same seats, and emptying the same trash bins. He knew every corner of this place. He knew which bathroom sink dripped, which light switch buzzed, and exactly how the acoustics changed when the hall was empty versus full. Most people would find this work boring. Wake up at 9 in the evening, work until 6 in the morning, go home and sleep while the rest of the world was awake. But Thomas never complained, not once, because this job gave him something precious. It gave him access to the one thing he loved more than anything else in the world: music. The Riverside Symphony Hall was one of the finest concert venues in Chicago. People came from all over the state to hear orchestras perform here. The building itself was over 100 years old, with red velvet seats, golden chandeliers, and walls that seemed to breathe with the memory of every note ever played inside them. During the day, when Thomas slept in his small apartment across town, this place was alive with rehearsals, musicians tuning their instruments, conductors shouting instructions, administrators rushing around with clipboards. But at night it belonged to him. Well, him and the silence. Thomas grew up in a house full of music. His father played piano in jazz clubs around the city. Not the fancy kind of clubs where rich people sipped expensive wine. No, his father played in small basement bars where working people came to forget their troubles for a few hours. His mother sang in the church choir every Sunday, her voice so beautiful it made people cry. Their apartment had been tiny, just 2 bedrooms for a family of 5, but it was always filled with sound. His father practicing scales on their old upright piano, his mother humming while she cooked, his older sister playing scratchy records on the turntable. Thomas had been good at music too. Really good. His high school music teacher said he had a gift, that he could feel music in a way most people never would. When Thomas was 17, he got accepted to the Chicago Conservatory of Music on a full scholarship. His parents threw a party. His mother made a special cake. His father played all night at the piano, so proud he couldn't stop smiling. But 3 months before Thomas was supposed to start college, his father collapsed during a performance. Heart attack. He died before the ambulance arrived. Everything changed after that. The music in their house died with his father. Medical bills piled up. Funeral costs. His mother tried to keep working, but the grief was too heavy. Thomas watched her fade a little more each day, so he made a choice. He gave up his scholarship. He got a job at a warehouse, then later as a security guard, and eventually as a janitor. He sent money home to help his mother and siblings. He told himself it was temporary, that he would go back to school later, that his dreams were just postponed, not gone. But temporary became 1 year, then 5 years, then 10. Now Thomas was 42 years old. His mother had passed away 3 years ago. His siblings had their own families, and he was still pushing a cleaning cart through an empty concert hall. Most of the people who worked at the Riverside Symphony Hall during the day didn't know his name. The musicians walked past him without making eye contact. The administrators gave him instructions like he was part of the furniture. Can you clean the lobby bathrooms first tonight? Don't forget to replace the light bulb in the east wing. Make sure you lock up properly. Only a few people treated him like a real person. There was Helen, the older lady who worked at the coat check. She always asked about his day and brought him cookies around the holidays. And there was Paul, one of the violinists, who once stayed late to help Thomas move a heavy piece of equipment and actually had a conversation with him about baseball. But mostly, Thomas was invisible. He didn't mind too much anymore. Being invisible had its advantages. It meant people forgot he was there, which meant he could listen. Every night as Thomas cleaned, he listened to the recordings of that evening's rehearsal playing in his head. He had been doing this so long that he could remember entire pieces of music, just from hearing the orchestra practice them during the day. While he mopped, he conducted in his mind. While he emptied trash, he heard the violins. While he polished the seats, he felt the timpani drums in his chest. And late at night, when he finished all his cleaning duties and had an hour before sunrise, Thomas did something he never told anyone about. He went to the storage room on the third floor. This room was supposed to be locked, but the lock had been broken for years and nobody had bothered to fix it. Inside, covered with a dusty cloth, sat an old piano that the symphony no longer used. It was out of tune and missing a few keys, but it still worked. Thomas would sit on the worn bench, crack his knuckles, and play. He played his father's old jazz compositions, the ones he remembered from childhood. He played hymns his mother used to sing. He played pieces he learned back in high school. And sometimes he played his own music. Songs that came from somewhere deep inside him. Melodies that he couldn't explain but that needed to come out. In those quiet hours before dawn, with his rough hands on the keys and his eyes closed, Thomas wasn't a janitor. He was a musician again. In his cleaning cart, hidden under the spray bottles and trash bags, Thomas kept a worn leather notebook. It had belonged to his father. Inside were handwritten musical arrangements, notes, ideas, and half-finished compositions. His father had been working on something special before he died, a piece that combined jazz with classical music in a way Thomas had never heard anywhere else. For years, Thomas had carried this notebook with him, too afraid to open it, too sad to look at his father's handwriting. But about 6 months ago, something changed. He started reading through it again, started understanding what his father had been trying to create, and he started adding his own notes to it. At first, just a few scribbles in the margins, then whole pages of his own ideas. Before he knew it, Thomas was composing again, not just playing other people's music, but creating something new, something that felt like it connected his father's world with his own. He told himself it was just a hobby, just something to pass the time, nothing serious. But deep down, in a place he barely admitted to himself, Thomas knew the truth. That old hunger was back, that need to create, to express something that words couldn't say. That dream he thought he had buried 15 years ago was still alive, waiting in the dark like a seed underground, ready to grow if it just got a little bit of light. Thomas finished mopping the main hallway and checked his watch. 2 a.m. He had 4 more hours before his shift ended. Plenty of time to clean the rest of the building and still have that precious hour with the piano. As he pushed his cart toward the east wing, he noticed a flyer taped to the bulletin board near the offices. He almost walked past it like he did every night, but something made him stop. The flyer was bright yellow with bold black letters. Annual Chicago Composers Competition. Open to all residents. Submit your original work. Winner performs at the Riverside Symphony Hall. Thomas stood there for a long moment, reading and rereading those words. The deadline was 3 weeks away. His heart started beating faster, the way it used to when he was 17 and the whole world seemed possible. Thomas stared at that yellow flyer for so long that his eyes started to blur. 3 weeks. That's all the time he had to finish a complete musical composition and submit it to the competition. A composition that would be judged by professional musicians and critics. A composition that might actually be performed by a real orchestra. His hands were shaking as he pulled the flyer down from the bulletin board and folded it carefully into his pocket. The paper felt like it was burning a hole through his work uniform. Could he really do this? It had been over 20 years since he'd seriously composed anything, and even back then he was just a student. What made him think he could compete against real composers? People who went to prestigious schools and studied with famous teachers. People who did this for a living. But another voice in his head, one that sounded a lot like his father, whispered back, "You've been composing for months now. You've got something special in that notebook. Why not try?" The next 3 days passed in a blur. Thomas went through his usual routine, cleaning the concert hall from top to bottom, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Every sound became part of a rhythm. The swish of his mop, the clang of the trash bin, the hum of the heating system. Everything was music if you listened hard enough. On the 4th night, something happened that changed everything. The symphony had a guest conductor coming in from Europe. His name was Viktor Petrov, and apparently he was a very big deal. Thomas had heard the staff talking about him all week. He's worked with the Berlin Philharmonic. He's conducting at La Scala next season. He's very particular about everything. What they really meant was that he had a reputation for being difficult. Thomas had learned to read between the lines after 15 years of listening to workplace gossip. That evening, the orchestra was having a late rehearsal. This was unusual. Normally, they finished by 9, giving Thomas time to start his cleaning while they packed up. But Viktor Petrov insisted on going late. He wanted perfection, and he didn't care whose schedule it disrupted. Thomas waited in the maintenance room on the second floor, reading through his father's notebook and adding his own ideas. He could hear the orchestra below, playing the same section over and over again. Victor's voice would boom out, stopping them, demanding they do it differently. The musicians sounded tired and frustrated. Finally, around midnight, Thomas heard the sounds of instruments being packed away and people leaving. He gave them 30 extra minutes to clear out, then grabbed his cleaning cart and headed down to the main hall. What he didn't know was that Viktor Petrov was still there. Thomas pushed through the double doors into the concert hall, his cartwheels squeaking as usual. The house lights were on, making the empty red seats glow. He started his routine, putting fresh trash bags in the bins along the aisles. That's when he heard it. A dripping sound. Thomas looked up. There was a water stain spreading across the ceiling near the stage. It had been raining hard that evening, and apparently the old roof was leaking again. As he watched, a drop of water fell and hit the conductor's podium with a loud plop. This was bad. Water damage could ruin the expensive wooden stage. Thomas needed to fix this right away before it got worse. He quickly pushed his cart toward the stage, pulling out a bucket and some towels. He'd need to put something under the leak and then call the building supervisor in the morning. He climbed up the stairs to the stage, focused on the leak, not paying attention to anything else. He positioned the bucket carefully under the drip and started wiping up the water that had already fallen. "What do you think you're doing?" Thomas jumped at the voice. He spun around and saw a man standing in the wings of the stage. Viktor Petrov. He was in his 50s with gray hair swept back from his face and sharp eyes that seemed to cut right through you. He wore an expensive-looking black suit and held his conductor's baton in one hand like a weapon. "I'm sorry, sir," Thomas said quickly. "There's a leak in the ceiling. I was just trying to prevent damage to the stage." Viktor walked toward him slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. "Do you have any idea what you just interrupted?" Thomas was confused. "I thought rehearsal was over. I heard everyone leave. Everyone except me," Viktor said coldly. "I was in my dressing room reviewing tomorrow's program. This is my thinking time, my preparation time, and you come barging in here like you own the place." "I really am sorry," Thomas said. "But the leak, I don't care about a leak," Viktor cut him off. "I care about maintaining the sanctity of this performance space. Do you understand what happens here? This is where art is created, where musicians pour their souls into their craft. And you think you can just walk in with your mop and bucket whenever you please?" Thomas felt his face getting hot. He'd dealt with rude people before, but something about Viktor's tone made his stomach twist. "I'm just doing my job, sir. Keeping the building safe." Viktor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your job? Yes, let's talk about your job. You clean toilets and take out trash. That's your contribution to this institution. Meanwhile, we create beauty. We dedicate our entire lives to perfecting our art. Do you see the difference?" Thomas didn't respond. He just stood there holding his dirty towel, feeling smaller by the second. But Viktor wasn't done. He stepped closer, looking Thomas up and down like he was examining something unpleasant. "You probably think what we do is easy, don't you? You listen to us rehearse every night and think, oh, I could do that. But you have no idea. No idea of the training, the sacrifice, the pure talent required to stand where I'm standing." Something in Thomas snapped. Maybe it was the exhaustion from working nights for 15 years. Maybe it was the frustration of having given up his dreams. Maybe it was the weight of that competition flyer burning in his pocket. But suddenly he couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Actually," Thomas heard himself say, "I do know." Viktor's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me?" "I know about the training. I had a scholarship to the Chicago Conservatory. I know about the sacrifice. I gave up everything to support my family after my father died. And I know about talent. I've been composing music since before you probably knew my name." The words came out before Thomas could stop them. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might explode. What was he doing? He was going to get fired. He needed this job. But Viktor's expression wasn't angry anymore. It was something worse. It was amused. Viktor started laughing. Really laughing. A deep belly laugh that echoed through the empty concert hall. "You, a composer? That's the funniest thing I've heard all week." He turned away, still chuckling, and walked toward the edge of the stage. When he looked back at Thomas, his face was full of mockery. "Let me give you some advice, janitor. Dreaming about being a musician and actually being one are two completely different things. You can listen to music every night for 100 years and it won't make you an artist. Some people are meant to create and some people are meant to clean up after the creators. That's just how the world works. Victor picked up his jacket from a nearby chair and headed toward the exit. As he reached the door, he called back over his shoulder. "And get that leak fixed properly. I don't want to hear dripping during tomorrow's rehearsal." Then he was gone, leaving Thomas alone on the stage with his bucket and his towels and his wounded pride. For a long time, Thomas didn't move. He just stood there in the bright stage lights, feeling the anger and humiliation wash over him in waves. He thought about Victor's words. Some people are meant to create and some people are meant to clean up after the creators. Was that true? Had Thomas been lying to himself all these years? Maybe he was just a janitor with delusions of grandeur. Maybe that's all he'd ever be. He finished fixing the leak mechanically, not really paying attention to what he was doing. When he was done, he pushed his cart back to the maintenance room and sat down on an old chair in the corner. His father's notebook was still in the cart, tucked under the cleaning supplies. Thomas pulled it out and opened it to the pages where he'd been working on his own composition. The one he'd been adding to for months, the one that combined his father's jazz ideas with classical orchestration. The one that told the story of people who worked in the shadows while others took the spotlight. He looked at those pages for a long time. Then he pulled out the yellow flyer from his pocket and smoothed it out on his knee. 3 weeks until the deadline. 3 weeks to prove Viktor Petrov wrong. 3 weeks to show that maybe, just maybe, a janitor could be a composer too. Thomas took out a pen and started to write. Not because he thought he would win. Not even because he thought he had a chance. But because Victor's laughter was still ringing in his ears, and the only way to silence it was to finish what he'd started. The sky outside the windows was just starting to turn gray with the first hints of dawn. Thomas had another hour before his shift ended. Another hour before he had to go home and sleep and pretend to be just a janitor again. But right now, in this moment, with his pen moving across the page and music filling his head, he was something more, and nobody, not even Viktor Petrov, could take that away from him. Thomas didn't sleep much after his shift ended that morning. He went home to his small apartment, lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling for an hour before giving up. His mind wouldn't stop replaying Victor's laughter. That mocking smile. Those words that cut deeper than any knife. Some people are meant to create, and some people are meant to clean up after the creators. At 8 in the morning, instead of sleeping, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with his father's notebook spread out in front of him. He had 3 weeks. 21 days to create something worthy of submission. Something that would prove he wasn't just a janitor with foolish dreams. The problem was he had never actually written a full orchestral piece before. In high school, he'd composed short works for piano or small ensembles. The ideas in his father's notebook were brilliant but incomplete. Thomas had been adding to them for months, but it was all fragments. Pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together yet. He needed help, real help, but who could he possibly ask? Thomas made himself a cup of coffee and thought about the people he knew at the symphony hall. Helen from the coat check was kind, but she didn't know anything about music composition. Paul the violinist was friendly, but Thomas barely knew him. The rest of the staff treated him like wallpaper. Then he remembered someone else. A cellist named Claire who often stayed late after rehearsals to practice. Thomas had noticed her because she was one of the few musicians who ever acknowledged him. She'd say good evening when he came to clean or thank you if he held a door open for her. Small things, but they mattered. More importantly, he'd overheard her talking to other musicians about composition. She taught music theory on the side, giving private lessons to students. If anyone might be willing to help him, it would be her, but asking for help meant admitting what he was trying to do. It meant risking more mockery, more humiliation. Thomas took a long sip of his coffee and made a decision. He'd already been humiliated by Victor. What did he have to lose? That night, Thomas arrived at work 30 minutes early. He found Claire in one of the practice rooms working through a difficult passage. He knocked softly on the doorframe. She looked up and smiled. "Hey there. You're here early tonight." Thomas's mouth felt dry. "I was wondering if I could talk to you for a minute." "About music." Claire set down her cello, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "Of course. Come in." Thomas stepped inside and closed the door. For a moment he couldn't find the words. Then he just blurted it out. I'm trying to compose something for the Chicago Composers Competition, and I have no idea what I'm doing." He waited for her to laugh, to give him that same look Victor had given him. Instead, Claire's face lit up. "Really, that's amazing. I didn't know you were interested in composition." "I don't really talk about it," Thomas said quietly. "Most people here don't know I even care about music. They just see the janitor." Claire nodded slowly, understanding crossing her face. "I get that. But you know what? Some of the greatest composers in history came from unexpected places. Talent doesn't care about job titles." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down. Tell me about your piece." For the next hour, Thomas shared everything. His father's jazz background, the notebook full of ideas, the way he'd been secretly combining jazz elements with classical orchestration, how he wanted to tell the story of people who worked in the shadows, the invisible ones who kept the world running while others slept. Claire listened intently, asking questions, making suggestions. When Thomas showed her the pages he'd written, her eyes widened. "Thomas, this is good. Really good. The harmonic structure here is sophisticated. And this melody," she hummed a few bars, "it's haunting." "But it's not finished," Thomas said. "I don't know how to orchestrate properly for a full symphony. I know what I hear in my head, but I don't know how to write it down in a way that musicians can actually perform." Claire thought for a moment. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. I can't write it for you, that wouldn't be fair. But I can teach you. We've got 3 weeks. If you're willing to work hard, really hard, I can show you what you need to know about orchestration. The rest is up to you." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. Hope, maybe. Or just relief that someone believed in him. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I remember what it's like to have a dream that everyone else thinks is impossible," Claire said simply. "And because I heard Victor yelling at you the other night. I was in the storage room and the sound carried. What he said to you was cruel and wrong. So she'd heard everything." Thomas felt embarrassed all over again. "He's not completely wrong, though. I am just a janitor." "No," Claire said firmly. "You're a person who works as a janitor. That's different. Your job doesn't define who you are." She picked up her cello again. "Now let's get started. Show me what you've got so far and we'll figure out how to make it shine." The next 3 weeks became the hardest of Thomas's life. He worked his regular night shift at the Symphony Hall, but now instead of going home to sleep, he spent 2 or 3 hours with Claire, learning everything he could about orchestration. Which instruments blended well together, how to write for strings versus brass versus woodwinds, when to use which percussion instruments for emotional impact. During his actual work hours, Thomas moved through his cleaning duties like a robot, his mind always half focused on the music. He started carrying a small notebook in his pocket so he could jot down ideas whenever they came to him. Sometimes he'd be mopping a floor and suddenly hear a perfect transition between movements in his head, and he'd have to stop and write it down before he forgot. He barely slept. 4 hours a day, sometimes less. He lived on coffee and whatever cheap food he could grab between shifts. His eyes had dark circles under them, and his hands ached from gripping the pen for so many hours, but slowly, painfully, the piece came together. Thomas called it Night Symphony. It had 4 movements, each one representing a different part of the night shift. The first movement was about loneliness, the sound of footsteps echoing in empty hallways. The second was about the hidden life of a building at night, all the sounds that people never noticed during the day. The third movement was softer, more introspective, about dreams and memories and the things people held onto in the dark. And the final movement was about dawn, about hope, about the quiet dignity of work that nobody sees but that matters anyway. He wove his father's jazz melodies throughout the piece, letting them dance with classical structures in a way that felt both old and new. It was like having a conversation across time, his father's voice speaking to his own. With 5 days left until the deadline, Thomas and Claire met in the practice room one last time. He had finished the full score. Every note written down, every instrument assigned, every dynamic marking in place. His hands were shaking as he handed her the pages. Claire spent an hour going through it, occasionally humming sections or tapping out rhythms. Thomas sat in the corner, terrified, wondering if he'd wasted 3 weeks of his life on something that was actually terrible. Finally, Claire looked up. Her eyes were wet. "Thomas, this is beautiful. It's really, truly beautiful. You're not just saying that. I'm not just saying that. She wiped her eyes and laughed a little. I'm actually jealous. This is better than anything I could write. But then her expression changed, becoming more serious. There's one problem, though. Thomas's heart sank. What? The competition requires a recording, not just a written score. They want to hear what it actually sounds like. She gestured around the practice room. We don't have access to a full orchestra, and hiring musicians to record this would cost thousands of dollars. Thomas hadn't thought of this. Of course they would want a recording. How could judges evaluate a piece of music without hearing it? So what do I do? Claire bit her lip, thinking. There might be a way. It won't sound as good as a real orchestra, but it's better than nothing. There's composition software that can create digital mock-ups. It uses computer-generated instruments that sound almost real. The community center downtown has a music lab with the right software. I teach there on weekends, so would they let me use it? I'll make sure they do, Claire said. But we need to work fast. You have to input every single note into the computer program. For a full orchestral piece, that's going to take days. Thomas didn't hesitate. Then let's start now. The next 4 days were a blur of exhaustion and determination. During the day, while Thomas should have been sleeping, he sat at a computer in the community center's music lab, painstakingly inputting every note of his composition into the software. Claire sat beside him, helping him understand the program, showing him how to adjust the digital instruments to sound as realistic as possible. His fingers cramped. His eyes burned from staring at the screen. He drank so much coffee that his hands developed a permanent tremor. But slowly, note by note, measure by measure, Night Symphony came to life. On the final night before the deadline, at 2 a.m, Thomas clicked the play button one last time. The music poured out of the computer speakers. It wasn't perfect. The digital instruments didn't have the warmth of real ones, but it was close enough. Close enough to hear what he'd created. Close enough to know it was real. When the final note faded away, Claire was crying openly. You did it, she whispered. Thomas saved the file to a thumb drive with trembling hands. He had 8 hours until the submission deadline. 8 hours to decide if he was really going to go through with this. He looked at Claire. What if Victor's right? What if I'm just embarrassing myself? Then you embarrass yourself, Claire said. But at least you tried. At least you proved to yourself that you could finish it. That's more than most people ever do. Thomas thought about his father working in small jazz clubs, never famous, never rich, but always playing, always creating. He thought about his mother singing in church choirs for no money, just for the love of it. Okay, he said finally. Let's submit it. At 9 that morning, exhausted beyond belief, Thomas filled out the online submission form. He uploaded his score and his recording. In the box marked composer name, he typed, Thomas Andrew Rivera. Then he hit submit. And for better or worse, there was no taking it back. After Thomas submitted his composition, he went home and slept for 16 hours straight. When he woke up, he felt hollow, empty, like he'd poured everything he had into those pages of music and now there was nothing left inside him. He told himself not to expect anything. There were probably hundreds of submissions, maybe thousands. Professional composers with degrees and connections and years of experience. What chance did a janitor have against people like that? 2 weeks passed. Thomas went back to his normal routine. Work at night, sleep during the day, try not to think about the competition. He avoided Claire at the symphony hall, too embarrassed to face her. What if his submission was so bad that the judges just laughed and deleted it? What if Claire realized she'd wasted her time helping him? Then one Tuesday evening, Thomas woke up to 17 missed calls on his phone. His heart jumped. Something must be wrong. Maybe his brother or sister had an emergency. He called his voicemail with shaking hands. Mr. Rivera, this is Janet Chen from the Chicago Arts Council. We've been trying to reach you about the composers competition. Please call us back as soon as possible at... Thomas played the message 3 more times to make sure he'd heard it right. The Chicago Arts Council. They wanted to talk to him. That could mean anything. Maybe they needed to clarify something about his submission. Maybe there was a problem with the recording quality. Maybe his phone rang again. The same number. Thomas answered it. Hello? Mr. Rivera. Thank goodness. This is Janet Chen. I've been trying to reach you all day. The woman on the other end sounded excited, almost breathless. I'm calling to inform you that your composition, Night Symphony, has been selected as one of 3 finalists for the Chicago Composers Competition. Thomas sat down heavily on his couch. I'm sorry, what? You're a finalist. Your piece will be performed by the Riverside Symphony Orchestra at the gala concert 3 weeks from now. Congratulations. The room seemed to spin. Are you sure? You have the right, Thomas Rivera? Janet laughed. I'm absolutely sure. The judges were unanimous. They said your piece was bold, original, and deeply moving. One judge said it was the most emotionally honest composition they'd heard in years. Thomas couldn't speak. His throat had closed up completely. Mr. Rivera, are you still there? Yes, he managed to choke out. I'm here. I can't believe it. Believe it, Janet said warmly. We'll be sending you official information via email, but I wanted to call personally to share the good news. We'll need you to come to several rehearsals, of course, and there will be media interviews. This is quite an honor. After he hung up, Thomas sat on his couch in silence for a long time. Then he started laughing. Then crying. Then laughing again. He probably looked crazy, but he didn't care. His father's notebook was on the coffee table. Thomas picked it up and held it against his chest. We did it, Dad, he whispered. We actually did it. The next evening at work, Thomas arrived to find the symphony hall buzzing with activity. People were clustered in groups, talking excitedly. When Thomas walked in with his cleaning cart, several conversations stopped. People turned to look at him. Helen from the coat check rushed over, her face beaming. Thomas, is it true? Are you one of the finalists? Word had already spread. Of course it had. The symphony would be performing the finalist pieces, so the musicians had been notified. Yes, Thomas said quietly. It's true. Helen threw her arms around him. That's wonderful. I always knew you were special. Other staff members came over to congratulate him. People who had barely spoken to him in 15 years suddenly wanted to shake his hand and hear his story. It felt surreal, like he'd stepped into someone else's life. But not everyone was happy. Thomas was cleaning the main hallway when he heard raised voices coming from the administrative offices. He recognized one of them immediately. Victor Petrov, this is absurd. A publicity stunt. Thomas moved closer, not quite eavesdropping, but not exactly walking away either. The competition was judged blindly by an independent panel, a woman's voice replied. That was Mrs. Patterson, the symphony's executive director. The judges had no idea who submitted which piece. They selected the finalists purely on musical merit. Then the judges are idiots, Victor shot back. You expect me to conduct a piece written by a janitor. Do you have any idea how that makes this institution look? It makes us look like we value talent over credentials, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. And yes, I expect you to conduct all 3 finalist pieces as contracted. Unless you'd like to break your agreement with us. There was a long silence. Then Victor spoke again, his voice cold. Fine, I'll conduct his little piece. But don't expect me to make it sound good. Thomas's hands tightened on his mop handle. He'd known Victor would react this way, but hearing it still hurt. You'll conduct it to the best of your ability, Mrs. Patterson said, or you won't conduct for this symphony again. Are we clear? Thomas didn't wait to hear Victor's response. He pushed his cart down the hallway, his heart pounding. 3 weeks until the performance. 3 weeks of working under the same roof as a man who despised him. The next few days were strange. During the day, Thomas received emails about rehearsals and interviews. At night, he pushed his cleaning cart past musicians who now whispered about him. Some seemed genuinely excited. Others looked at him with skepticism, like they were waiting for him to fail. Claire found him in the storage room one evening. I heard, she said, grinning. A finalist. Thomas, I'm so proud of you. Victor's furious, Thomas said. Of course he is. His ego can't handle the fact that someone he dismissed might actually be talented. She squeezed his shoulder. Don't let him get in your head. Your piece is good. The judges thought so, and they know what they're talking about. The media attention started small but grew quickly. First, a local newspaper ran a story. Janitor composes his way to symphony finals. Then a local TV station picked it up. Then it went viral online. Suddenly, Thomas's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with interview requests and messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. The story seemed to resonate with people. The underdog. The dreamer. The person who refused to let circumstances define their potential. Thomas hated the attention. He wasn't comfortable being in the spotlight. He'd spent 15 years being invisible, and now everyone wanted to know his story. Reporters camped outside his apartment building. They called the symphony hall asking for interviews. The worst part was that some people assumed he was only chosen because of his background. Diversity pick, one online commenter wrote. They're just trying to make themselves look good. The words stung worse than Victor's mockery had, but Thomas pushed through. He had to, because in 3 weeks his composition would be performed in front of hundreds of people. And he needed to be ready. The first rehearsal was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. Thomas requested time off from his night shift so he could attend. He'd never done that before in 15 years. His supervisor was understanding, even excited for him. Thomas arrived at the symphony hall at 2 in the afternoon, wearing the only suit he owned. It was old and didn't fit quite right anymore, but it was the best he had. He felt completely out of place walking through the front entrance instead of the service door. This was the entrance for audiences, for people who belonged here. The orchestra was already assembled on stage, tuning their instruments. Thomas slipped into a seat in the middle of the hall, trying to be invisible again. But then Mrs. Patterson spotted him. "Mr. Rivera, come down front. You should be where you can hear everything properly." Reluctantly, Thomas moved to the second row. He could feel eyes on him. Some of the musicians smiled and nodded. Others avoided looking at him. Then Viktor Petrov walked onto the stage. He didn't acknowledge Thomas at all. He simply picked up his baton, looked at the orchestra, and said, "We'll be starting with the Rivera piece. Let's get this over with." Thomas felt his face burn. Victor's disdain was obvious to everyone, but the musicians opened their sheet music professionally, waiting for direction. "From the top," Victor said flatly. He raised his baton. The orchestra lifted their instruments, and then they began to play. The first notes of Night Symphony filled the hall. Thomas stopped breathing. It was his music. His actual music. Not coming from a computer, but from real instruments played by real musicians. The lonely opening melody, played by a solo oboe, sounded exactly like he'd heard it in his head. Better even. But something was wrong. Victor was conducting it technically correctly, but with no emotion. No passion. He was treating it like an exercise, not a piece of art. The tempo was right, but it felt mechanical. Cold. The musicians were following his lead, playing the notes but not the feeling. Thomas could hear what it was supposed to sound like in his mind. The way the strings should swell in the second movement. The way the brass should punch through in the third. But under Victor's direction, it all felt flat. The orchestra played through the entire piece. When the final note faded away, there was silence. Victor lowered his baton and turned to face Thomas for the first time. That same mocking smile was on his face. "Well, Mr. Rivera, satisfied?" Thomas stood up slowly. His legs felt weak. Every eye in the hall was on him. "No," he said quietly. "That's not how it's supposed to sound." Victor's smile widened. "Oh? And what exactly do you think is wrong with it?" Thomas's heart was hammering. He wasn't a conductor. He had no right to criticize how Victor directed the orchestra. But he also couldn't let his piece be destroyed like this. "The second movement," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. "It's supposed to feel alive. Like a building at night when nobody's watching. Right now it sounds dead." "Perhaps your composition is just weak," Victor said coolly. "Or perhaps you're conducting it like you want it to fail," Thomas shot back. The entire orchestra went silent. Nobody spoke to Viktor Petrov like that. Victor's face turned red. He pointed his baton at Thomas like a sword. "How dare you? I'm one of the most respected conductors in the world. I've conducted at venues you could only dream of. And you, a janitor who's been composing for what, a few months? You think you can tell me how to interpret music?" "I can tell you how to interpret my music," Thomas said. He was shaking now, but he didn't back down. "Because I wrote it. I know what it's supposed to mean. And what you just did up there, wasn't it?" Victor stared at him for a long moment. Then he did something Thomas didn't expect. He laughed, but this time it wasn't mocking. It was something else. Something Thomas couldn't quite read. "Fine," Victor said. "If you're so certain you know better, why don't you come up here and show me?" Thomas froze. "What?" "Conduct it yourself. Show me how it's supposed to sound." Victor extended the baton toward him. "Unless you're afraid?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Thomas looked at that baton. at the orchestra watching him. At Claire in the cello section, her eyes wide. Then he started walking toward the stage. Thomas climbed the stairs to the stage, his legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. Every step echoed through the silent concert hall. 75 musicians stared at him. He'd never conducted anything in his life, not even a small ensemble, and now Viktor Petrov was handing him a baton and expecting him to lead a full symphony orchestra. This was a trap. Viktor wanted him to fail publicly, to prove that Thomas was nothing but a janitor with delusions. But Thomas took the baton anyway. The wood felt strange in his hand. Too light, too fragile. He turned to face the orchestra, and suddenly the hall seemed enormous. His mouth was completely dry. "I've never done this before," Thomas admitted, his voice barely carrying past the first row of musicians. "So I apologize if I make mistakes." A few musicians shifted uncomfortably. One violinist exchanged a worried glance with the person next to her. Viktor stood off to the side, arms crossed, that smug expression still on his face. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about all those nights alone in the storage room, playing the old piano. All those hours listening to rehearsals while he mopped floors. His father's notebook filled with dreams. His mother's voice singing in church. This was his music, his story, and nobody else could tell it the way it needed to be told. He opened his eyes and raised the baton. "The beginning should sound lonely," Thomas said to the orchestra, "like footsteps in an empty hallway at 3 a.m, like being the only person awake in the whole world." The oboe player nodded slightly, understanding in her eyes. Thomas brought down the baton. The first notes were tentative. Thomas's conducting was clumsy, his movements awkward and uncertain. He didn't have Viktor's polish or grace, but something else was there, something real. "More space between the notes," Thomas called out, stopping them. "Let each one breathe, like you're waiting for an echo that never comes." They started again. This time it was better. The loneliness came through. Thomas felt it in his chest, that ache of working nights while the rest of the world slept. As they moved into the second movement, Thomas started to lose his self-consciousness. He stopped thinking about technique and just felt the music. When the strings needed to swell, he showed them with his whole body, not just the baton. When the brass needed to punch through, he drove his hand forward like he was pushing open a heavy door. The musicians began to respond. They stopped looking at him like he was a curiosity and started actually listening, playing with him instead of just following technical directions. Claire caught his eye from the cello section and smiled. She understood what he was trying to do. The third movement was the heart of the piece. Softer, more introspective. Thomas had written it thinking about his father, about his mother, about all the dreams he'd buried for so many years. "This part is about the things we carry with us," Thomas said quietly to the orchestra. "The memories that keep us going when everything else is hard." He conducted it gently, almost like he was cradling something precious. The violin sang out with a sweetness that made his throat tight. The cellos provided a deep, warm foundation. It sounded like comfort, like home. When they reached the final movement, Thomas felt something shift. He wasn't just conducting anymore. He was living the music. The sunrise after a long night, the quiet dignity of work that nobody sees, the hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow could be different. His conducting became more confident, more certain. The orchestra followed him like they'd been playing together for years. The brass blazed. The strings soared. The percussion drove everything forward with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. As the final notes rang out, Thomas held his arms up, letting the sound fade naturally into silence. The last note hung in the air for a long, perfect moment. Then it was over. Thomas lowered his arms. He was shaking and sweating and could barely breathe. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then the orchestra started clapping, not just polite applause, real applause. Musicians tapping their bows against their music stands in the traditional show of respect. The percussion section was actually whistling. Claire was wiping her eyes. Thomas turned around slowly. Mrs. Patterson was standing in the aisle, also clapping. Several staff members had gathered at the back of the hall, drawn by the sound, and Viktor Petrov was staring at him with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. "That," Viktor said slowly, "was not what I expected." Thomas handed the baton back to him with trembling hands. "That's how it's supposed to sound." Viktor took the baton but didn't look away from Thomas's face. Something had changed in his eyes. The mockery was gone. "You've never conducted before?" "Never. But you've listened," Victor said quietly. "Really listened. I can tell." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, thoughtful instead of cruel. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Rivera. I judged you without knowing anything about you. That was wrong." Thomas didn't know what to say. This was the last thing he'd expected. "I will conduct your piece at the gala," Victor continued, "and I will conduct it the way you just showed me. With heart. You have my word." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur. Thomas continued working his night shift, but now the other musicians treated him differently. Not with pity or skepticism, but with respect. Several of them asked to hear about his composition process. Others shared their own stories of struggle and perseverance. The day of the gala concert arrived. Thomas's brother and sister drove in from out of town to attend. He sat with them in the audience wearing a new suit that Claire had helped him pick out. He felt like he might throw up from nervousness. The concert hall was completely packed. Every seat filled. People standing in the back. The first 2 finalist pieces were performed beautifully. Thomas barely heard them. His heart was pounding too hard. Then it was time for Night Symphony. The lights dimmed. Victor walked onto the stage to applause. He raised his baton and looked out into the audience. For just a moment his eyes found Thomas's. Victor nodded once. Then he began to conduct. It was perfect. Every nuance that Thomas had shown the orchestra 3 weeks ago, Victor brought out even more clearly. The loneliness in the first movement felt crushing. The hidden life of the second movement sparkled with secret joy. The memories in the third movement ached with longing, and the final movement built to a climax that had people literally on the edge of their seats. When the piece ended, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then the audience erupted. People jumped to their feet. The applause was thunderous, overwhelming. Thomas heard people cheering. His brother grabbed his shoulder. His sister was crying. "Stand up," someone near him said. "They want to see you." Thomas stood on shaking legs. The spotlight found him. Victor was gesturing for him to come to the stage. The applause got even louder. Thomas walked down the aisle in a daze. He climbed the stairs to the stage. Victor shook his hand firmly, then stepped aside, letting Thomas have the spotlight. Standing there, looking out at hundreds of people applauding for him, Thomas thought about the yellow flyer that had started all of this, about his father's notebook, about Claire's kindness and those late nights at the community center computer, about every time someone had made him feel invisible. He thought about Victor's words from that first terrible night. Some people are meant to create, and some people are meant to clean up after the creators. Thomas had proved that wasn't true. You could be both. You could be anything you wanted to be, if you were willing to work for it and brave enough to try. The awards were announced at the end of the night. Thomas didn't win first place. That went to the conservatory professor with 30 years of experience. But Thomas won second place and a commission to write another piece for the symphony the following season. More importantly, he won something money couldn't buy. He won his dream back, the one he'd thought he'd lost forever when his father died and life forced him to make hard choices. 3 months later, Thomas was still working as a janitor at the Riverside Symphony Hall, but now he was also a composer. He taught music theory on weekends at the community center, helping other people who thought their dreams were out of reach. A small chamber group had commissioned a piece from him, and he was working on a new composition for the symphony, this one about second chances. Some nights after his cleaning shift ended, Thomas still went to that storage room with the old piano. He'd sit down at the keys and play, just like he used to. But now he played differently. Not like someone hiding. Like someone who had finally found his voice. Victor stopped by one evening when Thomas was playing. He stood in the doorway listening silently. When Thomas finished, Victor spoke. "You know what the difference is between a good musician and a great one?" Victor asked. Thomas shook his head. "A good musician plays the notes correctly. A great musician understands that music is about truth, about being brave enough to share what's really inside you." Victor smiled, a real smile this time. "You're a great musician, Thomas. Don't ever forget that." After Victor left, Thomas sat at the piano for a long time, his hands resting on the keys. He thought about how much his life had changed. How one moment of courage, one decision to try despite everyone saying he couldn't, had opened doors he'd thought were locked forever. He pulled out his father's notebook, worn and familiar and open to a blank page at the back. With a pen from his janitor's cart, he wrote, "Dreams don't die. They just wait for us to be brave enough to chase them again." Then Thomas began to play, not for anyone else, just for himself. Just for the pure joy of creating something beautiful in the quiet hours before dawn. Outside the window, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of morning. A new day was beginning, and Thomas Rivera, janitor and composer, was exactly where he was meant to be.